All right. Thank you for joining me on this episode of The Gospel Truth. I'm your host, Marlon Wilson, and we have another great show for you. I've been missing for about 2 weeks, and it's been fun. I don't know if any one of you guys, everybody out there, I don't know if any of you guys was able to catch us in Arizona. We actually got done doing a live debate in Arizona at Apologia Church, and so that was fun, and that's where I've been, and I didn't have any other shows, so that was my only show, live show. But that footage should be up on the Gospel Truth channel here soon, so I hope you guys are looking out for that debate that's coming up. That's already done, but the footage will be up on the Gospel Truth, so be on the lookout for that. But I am excited for today because we have two high-end philosophers in the Gospel Truth house today. We have Dr. Kirk MacGregor and Dr. Guillaume Bignon, and I know I can pronounce that right. Dr. Guillaume will be able to correct me if I got it wrong, but I am so grateful to have these brothers in here today because they're going to be discussing the problem of evil from the Molinist position versus the Calvinist position, and I am excited for that one. But before I bring these guys in, I do want to encourage you to make sure you subscribe and hit that notification bell so you can stay in the loop with the Gospel Truth has going on, so you don't miss out on any shows the Gospel Truth has going on. Make sure you do that. Also, this content is not only on YouTube but also on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and yes, TikTok. So make sure, if you have yet to do so, make sure you are flowing over there to TikTok and follow a brother over there as well. If you haven't followed on the other platforms, I encourage you to get over there as well. Also, if you just like the audio, we do have a podcast option for you. So make sure you flow over to iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, and Spotify so you can jump on a podcast as well. And as always, I have some shows that are coming up here in the future that I want you to be aware of. All right. So I have a King James Version only debate. They're going to be talking about, like I have, I think Acts 12:4 is not going to be of discussion. It's just going to be Revelation chapter 16, verse 5, and 1 John 5 and 5, chapter 5, verse 7. And so I'm going to have Nick Sayers and Michael Borowski, so they're going to be coming on, and they're going to be having that debate. So be on the lookout for that one. After that, were people saved by faith and works under the old covenant? I have John O'Rourke, David Preston, and they go come on and give it a go. And I'm looking forward to this debate, and I hope that you are as well. After that, I have an interview, Dr. Michael Preciado. Oh man, I know I destroyed his name, but it's all good. He is going to be coming on here. We're going to be talking about free will, determinism, and moral responsibility. And so I think some of what me and Dr. Michael is going to be discussing, I think these guys today will probably get into a little bit of that as well. So that is going to be an exciting interview. So hopefully you guys be looking out for that one. And then lastly, is full preterism true? Jeremy Howard, Elvin Chandler. And so we're going to have a great debate. This is coming up in the future. So if you have yet to do so, make sure you subscribe and hit that notification bell so you don't miss out on any shows, commentaries, or debates. All right. So make sure you do that. That said, I really appreciate these two guys. I've read both of these guys. I've digested what they said. I appreciate what they discuss and what they've written on. And these guys have really blessed the church in many ways. And so I am so excited to have these guys on. And I pray that you are excited as well, because this is going to be a fantastic debate, okay, this is not a debate. I don't want to use the term debate. This is not a debate. This is just a discussion. All right. But nonetheless, they have converging views on said topic of problem of evil. So they're going to get into that. They're going to share some ideas. But before they do that, let me bring these guys in so they can introduce themselves to you guys. How you doing, fellas? How's it going?
Going very well. Thank you so much for having us on the show, Marlon.
Oh, no problem, man. I'm glad you guys came on, man. I'm excited for this one. The audience is excited for this one. So I don't really want to waste. Hey, Guillaume, did I get your name right, man?
Yes, very good. Very nice to be here.
All right, cool, man. Excellent. So, all right. So what we're going to do, we're not going to waste any more time. I'm going to give you guys a chance to introduce yourselves to the audience, and then we're going to jump into this discussion. All right. So start with Dr. Kirk, if you don't mind. Go ahead and give a quick introduction to yourself.
I'm Dr. Kirk MacGregor. I'm Associate Professor of Philosophy and Religion at McPherson College. I'm also the Department Chair. I have as my two major areas of training and my two major areas of research philosophy of religion and history of religion. I, at McPherson College, have probably just as many atheist and non-theistic students, not raised in any religious background, as I do religious believers. And so it's just a joy to teach undergraduates and to expose them to key ideas in philosophy and religion, and hopefully begin to help them to see the rationality of the Christian worldview. And by the way, Marlon wanted me to mention that when the website kirkmacgregor.org was posted down below, that website hasn't been up now for a couple of years. I would only maintain that website or update it like maybe 4 or 5 times every 3 or 4 years. And after a while, I figured it was just getting too hard to update. And I was too occupied with my academic work. So that website won't work. You can look me up on the McPherson College directory. However, you can go to mcpherson.edu, go to the directory and type in my name, and there you can find out more about me.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Kirk, for that introduction. All right, Dr. Guillaume, you're up. Go ahead and give a quick introduction yourself.
Yeah, so my name is Guillaume. I'm an engineer by training, software engineering. So I do work as a software engineering manager. I've worked for over 15 years on Wall Street, on the trading floor of corporate investment banks. That's my day job, if you will. And then I moonlight as a philosopher and theologian, which is really just a hobby that got out of hand. I grew up, I've spent most of my young life as an atheist, and then I became a Christian in my mid-20s, after which I realized that thinking about those questions was going to be an important part of my life. And so I ended up studying quite a bit personally and then in seminary. And then I ended up getting my PhD in philosophical theology. So I do research and writing and speaking on topics of interest, which include free will and determinism and moral responsibility and the kinds of issues that we're going to be discussing tonight. And more recently, I have spent quite a bit of time researching and writing and preparing some material on justification by faith, and particularly in conversations between Catholics and Protestants. So it's been a new interest of mine in more recent days.
All right, cool. Thank you guys once again. And so we're going to get into this. So the idea, this is not going to be, once again, this is not a knock them down, drag them out debate. I know many of you guys are used to that on this channel, but not today. All right. But anyway, so what we're going to do this is that both Guillaume and Kirk, Dr. Kirk is going to just lay out the positions, right? Maybe about 15 minutes. This is not going to be a stringent time ban. So the whole idea that I want these two guys to really be able to lay out their position in a very precise manner. So everyone will walk away with a clear understanding of their position. And then we're going to, once their positions are laid out, then we're going to have about a 50 minute discussion. And then we're going to have some Q&A from the audience, grab some of you guys' questions out there. So that said, Dr. Guillaume, you're up first. So you can start and I'll start your time.
All right. So it's a conversation around Calvinism and Molinism on the problem of evil. So there's not really a set thesis to debate, but I guess we're contrasting of views between Molinism and Calvinism with respect to the so-called problem of evil. Now, there's a number of different things that are called the problem of evil. So we'll see if we tackle several different versions of that. Maybe a good starting point would be the classical problem of evil as an argument from the atheist against the existence of God, which goes like this: if God is all-powerful, he can prevent all evil. And if God is all good, he wants to prevent all evil. And so if he can and he wants, then he does, but in fact he doesn't. And so he's not there, right? That's the gist of the argument from the atheist against God's existence. And in that light, Christians have known to respond with two different things. One is to say that God may not get all he wants, even though he's omnipotent. because indeterministic free will choices may turn out to fall on the wrong side, right? So it's the use of free will as an answer to the problem of evil, to say God cannot determine the outcome of human choices, otherwise they would not be free, because free will and determinism are not compatible. That's the incompatibilist position. And so that way God, even though he's omnipotent, cannot determine the outcome of our choices. So some of those fall on the wrong side. And so that's how we have evil, even though God really wishes that it didn't happen. It's just free will brings it about. And then the second response that's given by Christians traditionally is that even if God gets all he wants, he may not necessarily want there not to be any evil, even though he's perfectly good. Because there may be greater goods that necessitate the existence of evil, right? So evil might be a necessary means to the end of securing some greater goods that couldn't be secured without evil. So these are the two typical responses that challenge the premises of the argument from the atheist against God's existence. Now, technically, both of those responses can be phrased in a single response that encapsulates both of those. And it's to say that God has morally sufficient reasons for allowing evil. And one such reason may well be to give us this indeterministic free will that ends up causing a great deal of evil. But that really can be seen as a subset of the more general response that says God has morally sufficient reasons for allowing evil. And of course, the add-on to this response is to say that just because we don't know what those reasons are, at least not in every single specific case, it doesn't follow that God cannot have those purposes behind evil, right? So that's there's this aspect of not knowing which ones they are, but having to simply maintain there are good reasons. And so there's a component of trust here from the believer. But in terms of defeating the argument, it's good enough to maintain the possibility, or at least the the reasonable probability that God may have good reasons behind evil, so that his existence is not challenged by the fact that evil is there in this world. So that's the broad response to the problem of evil from a Christian point of view. And so when we contrast the Calvinist and Molinist positions, so we might get into the weeds a little bit of what positions, what each position affirms, but one big delineating area of disagreement between the two views is that I'm going to take the Calvinist view to be deterministic, that's affirming theological determinism. In other words, that God determines the outcome of human free choices. So human beings make choices, we are morally responsible, but the Calvinist says those are determined by God, and even though they are determined, it doesn't mean that they are not morally responsible or free. So the Calvinist view is a compatibilist view. That's the compatibility between free will and moral responsibility on the one side and determinism on the other. And so the Calvinist affirms that, and the Molinist, among the sets of affirmations that they make, is one of incompatibilism, so the view of free will that is incompatible with determinism, sometimes called libertarianism, right? That's the view that free will is incompatible with determinism, and also that we sometimes have free will. And so that disagreement places Calvinists and Molinists on the two sides of the compatibility debate. Is it compatible with determinism? And also, they are both affirming, like one is affirming determinism and the other one is denying it. So that's going to be one of the differences in how we respond to the problem of evil. That means that if you've paid attention, the very first response to the problem of evil is not one that the Calvinist is going to give, because he's not going to say that, in fact, free will is indeterministic. He's going to grant that God could determine our choices to be still free, but to fall on the other side, right? So to be different than what they are, even though he's omnipotent, he's good, he's determining that we do evil, and he could determine that we don't do that evil. All things being just as they are, at the moment of choice, God is in control of which choice is being made. So with that difference, there's going to be disagreement, and I suppose this discussion / debate is focusing on the problem of evil, which is typically an argument that's going to be used now not by the atheist, but by the non-Calvinist, against the Calvinist view. So if you will, on that debate, I'm going to be on the defensive, right? It seems like maybe Kirk is going to be bringing reasons from evil to think that Calvinism is false. And I'm going to have to try to defend the coherence of my Calvinist view in light of the existence and nature of evil in this world. But maybe a good place to point out some of the similarities between our views is that we both affirm that same response, that basic response to the problem of evil, which is that God has morally sufficient reasons. But we might very well be even much closer than this, because the Molinists' view says that free will is libertarian. It also affirms that God is using his knowledge of what we would freely do in any possible set of circumstances in order to achieve his own purposes, right? He knows what we would do, and so he places us in just the circumstances that will secure that the outcome of our choices do serve his purposes. So he predestines, he foreordains everything that happens, not by determining it like the Calvinists would have it, but by using his counterfactual knowledge, his knowledge of what we would freely do in every possible circumstances, in order to achieve his purposes. And so here's the difference between the two views of providence. The Calvinist is going to say that those counterfactuals, right, those statements about what we would freely do in any given circumstances, is fully determined by God. It's really within his prerogative to craft us in such a way that we would freely choose one way or another, given all the sets of circumstances that we could envision. Whereas the Molinist says that this knowledge is prevolitional for God, which means that God is not the one who controls the truth values of those counterfactuals. So it's something that he's faced with and he has to deal with, and he accounts for it in his providence, but he's not controlling the truth values of those counterfactuals. He's just presented with them prevolitionally. So that's the Molinist model, but it doesn't really tell you just how strongly the Molinist is going to disagree with the Calvinists based on just that, because it's important to assess that Molinism in itself doesn't tell you just how wrong those counterfactuals end up being. That is, that the God is presented with those counterfactuals of what we would freely do in any set of circumstances, and then that filters out some options for God, right? So he's faced with those counterfactuals, and he can change some of the circumstances, but he cannot change the truth of the counterfactual itself. So he has to play with those. And that means that he might limit his options. You know, if he would like a scenario to come about, he might not be able to do just the one that he wanted, but play with the antecedent of the counterfactuals a bit, place us in different circumstances to try to secure at least slightly diminished purposes, but not exactly the scenario that he wanted. That's if the counterfactuals fall on the wrong side. But for all the Molinist says, those counterfactuals might be just how God wants them to turn out, right? So purely logically, we could imagine that edge case where every single counterfactual the Molinist envisions turns out to be exactly like the Calvinist says that they are. In that case, there's not much of a filtering that happens, and God has just about the same freedom to pick among those scenarios as he would on Calvinism. That's possible given Molinism. So Molinism itself doesn't tell us just how strongly the Molinist story of evil and the Calvinist story of evil are going to differ. What's going to matter is any specific Molinist, how much they are going to be using libertarian free will as a response to the problem of evil, to say those instances of evil only happened because we have libertarian free will, and God tried to bring things differently, right? To bring about things differently, but because those counterfactuals limit his options, this is an evil that happens that's purely explained by libertarian free will. No other greater purpose than this, just libertarian free will. So the more a Molinist does that, the more he disagrees with the Calvinist, but he doesn't have to do that a whole lot, right? He could say that almost all of the evil that happens, God has simple greater goods that he's looking after, and this is exactly what he wants to bring about for the sake of those greater goods, exactly like the Calvinist says. So I think it's going to be helpful to see a little bit just where on the spectrum of Molinists Kirk falls, because I've heard him say some pretty robust things in favor of God's providence in the past. And I think I've mentioned to him that some of the things he says make me think that he's the kind of Molinist that I would be if I had to give up my Calvinism. That is, that he's making some pretty strong statements about predestination and election. I think that in his book, he's explaining that Molina rejects Arminius's exegesis of Romans 9. He's saying that election is not it's not a corporate election. It's not based on foreseen faith. That it's purely the electing grace of God, and that Molina says that any saved person in this world could have been lost, and any lost could have been saved in alternate worlds, and it's all in God's providence that one happens and not the other. So those kinds of very robust statements about providence and election are extremely close, and they almost melt my Calvinist heart. But we'll see just how much of a use of libertarian free will Kirk makes in this conversation about evil. For all I know, he could be telling a very similar story as the Calvinist one here. And what's the value here in our conversation from the fact that we are very close in these views? It's going to be interested a bit. I'm not just trying to say, hey, we're all friends, let's give each other hugs. It's actually serving my purposes in this conversation to point out just how closely we are, because as a result of being so close, right? So, I mean, there's a spectrum of views on free will and providence. Broadly, you can distinguish four main views. You have open theism, simple foreknowledge Arminianism, Molinism, and Calvinism. And I think I've sorted them out in order of strength from the emphasis on free will all the way to the emphasis on divine providence. And Molinism and Calvinism are the closest, right? So the Molinism is the closest to the Calvinist view on that spectrum. And the problem for the Molinist here, but of being so close to the Calvinist view, is that when you're this close, so my claim is twofold. One is that by being super close to the Calvinist view, they're going to say a lot of things that are right. When you're standing this close to the truth, then yeah, you're bound to say some really true things. But the difficulty for the Molinists here is that by being so close to the Calvinist view, some of the attacks on Calvinism are going to end up blowing in their face, if you will. So that's my contention in this conversation is that many of the arguments used by Molinists against the Calvinist view on the basis that there is evil end up being self-refuting because they equally refute Molinism as they do Calvinism. So that's a pattern that we might see unfold a little bit in this conversation when we take specific examples of arguments from evil against the Calvinist view. And my main claim is that they are either self-refuting or that they're question-begging. So that's a little bit of a claim that I develop in my book, Excusing Sinners and Blaming God, where I say that those families of arguments from evil against Calvinism end up either failing to identify something that's uniquely Calvinist and uniquely deterministic in the target, and as a result, they refute their own view that's not deterministic, or they successfully identify purely that it's the determinism that is the problem, but then they fail to tell us why determinism is a problem in a non-circular fashion, so that the argument ends up being either question-begging against determinism or self-refuting because it's refuting Molinism in the process. So that's my broad claim about those families of argument, and then we can a little bit address some of the specific articulations of that argument. So trying to not exceed too much time, just list some of the concerns that some have raised against the Calvinist view in light of the existence of evil. So there was the question of theodicy, right? So we have the initial argument from the atheist that says, why is there so much evil in the world? And here, I'm going to simply use the same response as the Molinists to say God has morally sufficient reasons. And just because we don't know those reasons doesn't mean that they're not there. So I will not be able to use free will in there, but I use the same answer, broadly speaking, as the Molinists. So it's going to be a bit hard here, and we'll see if Kurt is tempted to use that against the Calvinist view. But here my response is going to be, there's morally sufficient reasons. I don't know those reasons in most cases, but that doesn't mean they're not there. But beyond the pure question of theodicy, there's the question of whether God is inappropriately involved in evil. Right? So even if there's good reasons, it could be that by determining the outcome of our evil choices, God is somehow stained by it, right? And there's lots of ways of phrasing this problem. Some say that it makes God the author of sin, or that God brings about sin, or that God is responsible for sin. Some say that even it makes God sinning, that he's manipulating sin or causing sin or willing sin, or that he's not just permitting sin. All of those are different expressions of the concern of God being inappropriately involved in evil. So we might be discussing some of the specifics, and in each case, my contention is going to be that we're either begging the question against determinism or self-refuting for a Molinist to make a claim that also refutes their own view. That's my broad approach to the question of the problem of evil, and we'll see what we take the rest. I think that's good enough for now.
All right, Doctor, thank you so much for laying out your position. All right, Dr. Kirk MacGregor, you are up. So take your time, and you got it. And go for it. I'll start the time when you go for it.
All right. It's an honor to be discussing the problem of evil with Dr. Bignon. His book, Excusing Sinners and Blaming God, is the best defense of compatibilism that I have read. I'm sure we'll be in for an excellent discussion. Tonight, I'll be presenting a Molinist solution to the problem of evil. Now, I say a Molinist solution because I think there are many different solutions to this problem a Molinist could endorse, but I will take the one that seems most plausible to me. Let me begin by noting an intuition that many atheists and theists share. An all-good God would not determine other persons to commit evil. I realize that Dr. Bignon does not share this intuition. And I don't want to just leave things at the realm of intuition, although I do believe that's a very powerful intuition for most people. But I think a good argument can be made in favor of it. And I give this argument so as hopefully not to be accused of question begging. So the argument would run as follows. Premise 1. God has implanted his moral law in the soul of every human being. Romans 2:14 and 15. 2. According to that moral law, it is evil to determine another person to commit evil. 3. God's moral law flows necessarily from, and thus accurately represents, God's nature. 4. God at least would not, and perhaps could not, do evil. 5. God at least would not, and perhaps could not, act contrary to God's nature. 6. Therefore, God would not, and perhaps could not, determine another person to commit evil. I'll assume, for the sake of conversation, that the intuition is correct. I'm sure Guillaume will have something to say about that, and that this argument is sound. So now we face the question, can Molinism offer us a solution to the problem of evil according to which God does not determine other persons to commit evil? To up the ante, can Molinism offer us a solution to the problem of evil according to which God does not determine evil, period? At this point, I will briefly review the basics of Molinism. Molinism holds to the following logical scheme with regard to God's omniscience and decision-making. The first logical moment, dubbed natural knowledge, encompasses God's knowledge of all necessary truths. These include the laws of logic, mathematical truths, and all possibilities. Molinists hold that it is logically possible for God to create persons with libertarian freedom, which I take, not uncontroversially even among Molinists, to be the ability to sometimes choose between alternative thoughts or actions. It is also logically possible on Molinism for God to create a natural order with genuine or ontic quantum indeterminacy. The various logically possible conjunctions of these possibilities represent God's knowledge of all possible worlds. In the second logical moment, called middle knowledge, God knows all hypothetical conditionals of indeterminacy. Thus, God knows the truth values of all propositions of the following two forms. 1. If possible libertarian person P were in circumstances C insufficient to determine or necessitate P's behavior, P would libertarianly think thought T or do action A. 2. If possible, indeterministic natural process N unfolded in circumstances C, insufficient to determine or necessitate N's behavior, N would indeterministically unfold in way W. The logically possible conjunctions of these hypothetical conditionals of indeterminacy, or counterfactuals, with the elements of God's natural knowledge yields God's knowledge of all feasible worlds. Next, in the logical order, is God's decision of which world, if any, to create. Molinists hold that God libertarianly chose to create a world containing persons with libertarian freedom. A Molinist could also hold that the world God chose to create includes quantum indeterminacy, which I personally espouse. Finally, in the last logical moment, God's free knowledge, God knows all truths concerning the actual world. But which world, if any, does God choose? It seems that God, owing to his being all good, would choose an optimal world, by which I mean a world tied for the status of best feasible world, or choose not to create a world at all. Now, suppose that the highest good for a person is to gain eternal fellowship with God, the infinite source of all goodness and love, whom they have libertarianly chosen to love. This is what I take salvation to be. It seems to me that no finite human action or set of actions, such as a perfectly sinless life or loving God, could even in principle earn or merit this infinite good. But suppose that God has freely chosen to give salvation to those who libertarianly choose, in response to God's enabling grace, to love God and pledge allegiance to him. Then if God chooses to create a world, God would choose a world obtaining to an optimal salvific balance. Now, evil in the world is of three broad types: moral evil, epistemic evil, and natural evil. It is possible to explain moral evil and epistemic evil as the result of libertarian free choices on the part of humans and other created beings. And it is possible to explain natural evil as the result of quantum indeterminacy. Suppose God middle knows that only in feasible worlds involving a considerable amount of moral evil due to libertarian free choices and natural evil due to quantum indeterminacy, that the optimal salvific balance would be achieved. Now, the problem of evil, as Dr. Bignon helpfully laid out, maintains that it is either impossible or improbable that God and evil coexist. These options respectively assume the truth or probability that there is nothing an all-good God would want more than to prevent moral and natural evil. But if God has some overriding desire that God could accomplish while permitting but without determining such evil, then this assumption is false. And the Molinist thinks that God's overriding desire is to create a salvifically optimal world, if God opts to create a world at all. Creating such a world is a morally sufficient reason to permit the evil therein. Thus, the atheist would need to show, for the problem of evil to succeed, that there is, or is probably, a feasible world achieving salvific optimality, but with less moral and or natural evil. And how could the atheist ever show this? It is sheer speculation. Hence, God's actualizing a world of optimal salvation morally justifies God in permitting the moral and natural evil in the world, none of which God determines. At this point, the non-Molinist could object that libertarian freedom, which I have defined as the ability to sometimes choose between alternative thoughts or actions, is impossible, thus disqualifying the Molinist account. Although I can't tell from excusing sinners and blaming God if Dr. Bignon would agree with the potential argument I'm about to discuss, I can see how a reformed reader of his book could easily make it, based on an argument Dr. Bignon makes when contesting the principle of alternate possibilities. The argument would run as follows. 1. If libertarian freedom is true at the lowest level of specificity, then it is true at every higher level of specificity. 2. Divine praiseworthiness and impeccability show that libertarian freedom is false at the higher levels, i.e., God is not free to sin. 3. Therefore, libertarian freedom is false at the lowest level of specificity. For the sake of argument, I'll grant premise 2, although I'm not altogether sure about its truth. Here I shall contest premise 1. To refute it, all we need is a positive argument that libertarian freedom is true at the lowest level of specificity. I think a family of such arguments of the reductio variety can be made. Thus we could argue, 1. Suppose libertarian freedom is false at the lowest level of specificity. 2. Then God does not have libertarian freedom, but is rather determined by his nature to do everything he does. 3. Accordingly, God's nature determined God to create the space-time universe. 4. God is, at least without the universe, a timeless and changeless being. 5. If God's nature determined God to create the space-time universe, God's nature is the necessary and sufficient condition for the space-time universe to exist. 6. If the necessary and sufficient condition for an effect is timelessly present, then the effect is timelessly present as well. 7. Therefore, the space-time universe is timelessly present and does not have a temporal beginning. 8. But the space-time universe has a temporal beginning. 9. Therefore, libertarian freedom is true at the lowest level of specificity. Keeping premises 1 through 3 in place, one could likewise reason in reductio fashion that since God is a metaphysically necessary being, and any effect metaphysically necessarily produced by a metaphysically necessary being is itself metaphysically necessary, the universe is a metaphysically necessary being. Not only is this false, but it would also violate God's aseity. So God, at least, has libertarian freedom at the lowest level of specificity, choosing between equally good options, thus showing that the concept of libertarian freedom is logically possible. Hence, I don't see that there's anything preventing an omnipotent God from creating persons with libertarian freedom. Molinism also affords Christians a very helpful hermeneutic for understanding passages ascribing evil to God. Now, several passages of Scripture indicate that God cannot do evil, but other passages of Scripture indicate that God sent evil spirits to people, brought evil on persons or nations, killed, hardened Pharaoh's heart, and will send a powerful delusion to evildoers in the end times. I take it for granted that Scripture does not contradict itself. Accordingly, it follows that there must be more than one way for God to do or cause something, but Scripture does not explain these ways. Loving God with all our minds, it seems to me, impels us to use philosophy as theology's handmaiden and ask, are there different senses of doing or causing that can make sense of the biblical data? Ever since the 2nd century Greek apologists, one Christian interpretive principle is that passages of Scripture that seemingly militate against God's status as the maximally great being are correctly interpreted in such a way that avoid this implication. Molinism allows us to say that there are 2 ways in which God does things, only the first of which is captured in the modern sense of do or commit. The first sense is strong actualization, which means determining something to happen. The second is weak actualization, which means indirectly causing something to happen by creating circumstances in which a third party directly causes something to happen. If the actions of the third party are not intended by the actualizer, even if foreseeable to the actualizer, and if the actualizer creates the circumstances for some good reason, standing contrary to the third party's action, then the actualizer is not morally responsible for the effect of the third party. To quote the philosopher Thomas Crisp, the scriptures don't distinguish between cases of strong and weak divine actions. Israel's writers weren't metaphysicians. They weren't in the business of crafting philosophically precise analyses of divine action. They were quite clear that Yahweh acts in the world, but they didn't make efforts to distinguish whether the divine actions they were describing were cases of strong or weak action. Much divine action, they describe, is plausibly construed as weak action, end quote. It is up to us, as part of loving God with all our minds, to use our God-given ethical sensibilities to figure out which is which. In sum, God may create various circumstances for the good purpose of achieving a salvifically optimal world, even though the unintended side effects are moral and natural evil. As the greatest conceivable being, God only directly actualizes good things. Consequently, God is totally or partially responsible for all good that occurs in the world and is not responsible for any evil that occurs in the world. In the modern sense, God only does or commits what God directly actualizes and hence does no evil. Thus, I believe that Molinism affords a solution to the problem of evil, according to which God determines no evil and brings about the best feasible world, or a feasible world tied for the best, I should say, to atheists and theists alike who share the intuition that it is evil to determine another person to commit evil, and perhaps the further intuition, which I have not defended, that it is evil to determine evil. Molinism provides, in my judgment, the most attractive solution to the problem of evil.
Are you good to go, Doctor?
I'm good.
All right, cool, excellent. That's a pretty abrupt stop. I thought you was gonna continue on, but all right, good stuff, man. Appreciate you guys. All right, so now we are going to transition to our bit of a cross-examination discussion between you two. So this is like the favorite part of every discussion, and I'm sure you guys have seen a bunch of debates. So we'll be listening with good ears to what you guys have to say. So you guys will be discussing about 40 minutes, 50 to 40 minutes. So once again, audience, as they are discussing, make sure that you guys are getting your questions in, because there will be a Q&A after the discussion. They'll love to tackle some of your questions. So, all right, that said, you guys have the stage for about 40, 50 minutes.
All right, I'm not sure where we are taking this. Is there any specific area that you'd like to drill through, or questions that you want to ask? Or I'm happy to tackle some of the points that you've made in the in your opening statement to see where we go from there, if you will. You tell me what makes sense for you guys.
Well, what makes sense for me, and the thing that I was most taken aback by, both in your book and in your opening remarks, is that the Calvinist and Molinist alike can say God has morally sufficient reasons for permitting the evil in the world. In other words, that the Calvinist and Molinist alike can both use the greater good defense. And my skepticism that the Calvinist can do that is simply based on my reading of John Calvin. I tried to read through the Institutes before tonight to make sure I'm not misrepresenting him. And just to give one quote from Calvin's Institutes in 3:23:2, Calvin says, "For God's will is, and rightly ought to be, the cause of all things that are. For if it has any cause," and I'll add there, such as God's nature, "something must precede it, to which it is, as it were, bound. This is unlawful to imagine. For God's will is so much the highest rule of righteousness that whatever he wills, by the very fact that he wills it, must be considered righteous. When, therefore, one asks why God has so done, we must reply, because he has willed it. But if you proceed further to ask why he so willed, you are seeking something greater and higher than God's will, which cannot be found. Let man's rashness then restrain itself and not seek what does not exist." It seems to me that it follows from that for Calvin, God can create anything that a Calvinist considers a possible world. So let's suppose, for the sake of argument, that the Calvinist would say that human libertarian free will is logically impossible. Then it seems obvious, and here I will simply appeal to intuition, it seems obvious that the best possible world, you'd have to kind of redefine salvation from the way I understand it. You'd have to drop from my definition that the person is libertarianly chose to love God, but you could just say salvation is gaining eternal fellowship with God. It seems obvious that the best possible world is one where God determines that no one ever sin, all receive God's grace, all receive salvation, no evil at all occurs. But it is obvious that this is not that world. God can create that world, and God doesn't. In that case, it seems the greater good defense, or the morally sufficient reason defense, doesn't work, as God doesn't need evil to bring about that world. So it seems to me that the greater good defense is only available to the non-Calvinist. And so I'm wondering, Guillaume, where do you think the error in my argument is?
Yeah, the error is in supposing that because you don't see those possible good reasons, therefore the response is not available, right? The response is exactly along those lines, to say there are morally sufficient reasons, there are greater goods that God is after, and just because we don't know those reasons doesn't mean they're not there. The intuition that you're trying to share is to say, I can't possibly think of anything that would be better for God than to save everybody or to avoid every single sin in the world. So what you're saying is you're sharing your ignorance of what good reasons there might be, which is the exact move that the atheist is doing with the problem of evil, saying there could not, I cannot imagine what God would be thinking in allowing all this evil in the world. Therefore, it's not justified, and therefore God is not there. So once again, I found myself in the same position as I am in responding to the atheist, simply saying, yes, I hear your inability to see those morally good reasons, but just because we don't see them or you don't see them doesn't mean that they're not there, and that God could be having morally sufficient reasons by those greater goods, even if I can't spell out in every single instance what those greater goods are. So I don't think that I don't think your problem is with the ability to use the greater goods defense. I think your concern is that maybe the absence, like those greater goods are harder to identify, and therefore it makes it more difficult to hold in the face of our inability to say what those reasons are. I think that might be the nature of your concern here.
Yeah. Going back to my statement, when I was trying to make an argument that God would not and perhaps could not determine another person to commit evil, I think it's more than just an intuition there. It's the idea that according to God's moral law, and by God's moral law, I don't mean the Torah, I don't mean the 613 mitzvot. I'm talking about the moral law that Paul describes in Romans 2:14-15. And it seems to me that that moral law, according to it, that the type of world that an all-good God would choose, if determinism is inescapable for God, if he's going to create anything, is to create a world of universal salvation, of no evil, and so forth. And I would say that God's moral law flows necessarily from and thus accurately represents God's nature. And so it seems to me that in order for you to avoid this, you have to adopt divine voluntarism. You have to say, no, God's moral law doesn't flow necessarily from, it doesn't accurately represent God's nature. It may be his preceptive will, but that doesn't really represent God's nature. And in that case, I don't know how you get around the Euthyphro dilemma. So I'd love to hear your thoughts there.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that I need to fight off the Euthyphro dilemma here. I'm not in the situation of trying to place the moral argument for God's existence. But in any case, the response for the what's the difference between what God commands us to do and what He's bound by His own nature to not do? There's a couple of things to say here. The first is, I don't know that He's telling us that it's wrong for us to determine someone else to do evil. Like, determining is a very philosophical term. I don't know that it's found anywhere. And if you try to phrase it in ways that are a bit falling short of determinism, right, to make someone else do something or to bring about that somebody else does that, then you're back to denying what you say God does, even on Molinism, right? Because as long as you fall short of talking about determinism, your Molinist view will commit you to saying that God does all of those things about evil, right? He does bring about evil. He does foreordain that evil happen. He makes people do evil. Now, he makes them freely do evil, right? On libertarian view, but he makes all of that. So all of that language of God's providentially bringing about evil is true on Molinism and will find itself refuted as long as you don't speak directly of determinism on the Calvinist view to criticize it. But if you do speak of determinism purely, then it's question begging, because, yeah, you're saying it's wrong to determine evil. Okay, well, I disagree with that. So now where do we go from here? If you readjust by giving me something a bit milder than determinism, you refute Molinism in the process. Now, and the second point I wanted to make about this distinction about what God commands us to do and what he's seemingly bound by his nature not to do is that there's plenty of things that we know are exactly like that, where the distinction between the creator and the creatures is such that there are things that are wrong for us to do, but that God has perfectly the prerogative of doing so without being morally tainted, right? Taking somebody else's life is one notorious example. God is free to take my life this very moment if he pleases. He's the author and creator of my life, is the author and creator of the world and sustainer of it. If it pleases him to simply seize my life right now by stopping my heartbeat, there's nothing wrong with that, right, in God's purposes. But if I were to go and stop your heartbeat, I think that would be morally wrong indeed. So there's plenty of things that are different in terms of obligations for us as human beings than they are for God. And I don't see that determining somebody else to do evil couldn't be one of those things where there's a distinction and asymmetry between what's okay for God to do and what's not okay for me to do.
But it seems still in that case that the moral law that God has given us, that it doesn't flow necessarily from God's nature. I guess that's what I'm concerned about. And in the book, you're able to show differences between, like, people on divine determinism and pets, puppets, coerced people, manipulated people, and mentally ill people. I'm not sure those are the relevant differences, but I'll leave that aside for now. However, one point I'll concede to you is that none of those are actual cases of determination. So I wondered, do I really know, or do I really, do we have this strong sense that it's wrong to determine someone else to commit evil? Is that part of the moral law that God has written on our hearts? And so I thought, how would you handle an actual case of determination? And of course, my mind goes to demon possession. Mark 5 tells the story of the Gerasene demoniac. And interestingly, it describes what the demon does as what the man does. So we could say, on your view, the man is really responsible for the evil that he carries out while he's being determined by this demon. And it describes the demon's actions as his own. So to quote it, this man lived in the tombs, and no one could bind him anymore, not even with a chain. For he had often been chained hand and foot, but he tore the chains apart and broke the irons on his feet. Night and day among the tombs and in the hills, he would cry out and cut himself with stones. When he saw Jesus from a distance, he ran and fell on his knees in front of him. He shouted at the top of his voice, "What do you want with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? In God's name, don't torture me." So the first thing I wonder, just to make sure I'm comparing apples to apples, that I'm comparing determination to determination here, is, let me ask you, on your view, to use J.P. Moreland's language, is there the same what it is like, qualitative feel or qualitative texture to doing something under demon determination versus doing something under divine determination?
I don't know. I've never been demon possessed myself. Do you have any first-hand experience? I don't know, you tell me. I don't know what that feels like. What I can tell you is you're trying to press me with an argument by analogy, right? To say that if we're determined by the demon and we cannot be morally responsible, then why would that be different for God? Or phrased symmetrically, to say if it's possible to be morally responsible when God determines us to do something, then why is it not, like, why don't we blame the demon possessed person for their demon possession? So there's a couple of different ways of doing so. First of all, we could have a tracking condition, right? So the person could be unable to resist the activity of the demon, but having freely brought this about, there could be a tracking, and so we could blame it on earlier choices. But leaving that fully aside, I think that my criteria for distinguishing cases of manipulation, at least in the chapter on manipulation in my book, the relevant difference that I bring between the cases of like mad scientists determining us to manipulating us to do something is the God-givenness of the impulses that we act upon, right? So the inclination, the fact that we act on our God-given characters and desires. So that condition is still present to relevantly distinguish between the case of the demon-possessed person and the case of being determined by God and morally responsible. So I would say that, yeah, maybe the demon is determining the outcome of the choice, and we could coherently say that the person is not morally responsible, assuming that there's no blameworthiness for being demon possessed in the first place. But if this is purely a taking over of their capacity, of their will, of their characters and desires, then there's a bypassing of God's character, God-given character and desire, which removes moral responsibility and is absent in the normal case of a free choice on Calvinism and compatibilism. So there's no incoherence in maintaining that one is morally responsible and that the other one is not. I see. I took another note on something that you said that seemed strange. Yes.
Yes.
You said the demon does what the man does. So once again, if you fall short of using determinism language, you're finding yourself saying things that are equally true on Molinism, right? So if we take issue with the fact that somebody else is doing that thing as well, right? As the Calvinist would say, well, God is the one who does, the bringing about of the outcome of those choices. Then the Molinist God does the same thing, right? He places us in circumstances that he knows we would, in which he knows what we would do, and so it's very meaningful to say he makes it happen. He does it as well, or like the Bible says that he does about evil, right? So he says, "I am the Lord, and there is no other. Beside me, there's no God. I form light and I create darkness. I make well-being and I create calamity." Right? I kill and make alive. So he's using active language of things, saying, I do those things. And yet we both agree that he's not blameworthy for those things, but his involvement in evil is described in very active terms of doing it. And so the Calvinist says, yes, that doing involves a determination. The Molinist says, no, it's not deterministic. But in that, I think that, again, the Molinist and Calvinists shake hands over the fact that God does all those things. They just disagree about the means through which he's doing it, right?
I would say that the Molinists and Calvinists disagree over whether, in the modern sense of the word, as opposed to the ancient Near Eastern and Greco-Roman sense of the word, that God does all of these things. As I explained, I think that you're left with this dilemma when you read both the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament, that it's very clear that God cannot do evil, or at least would not do evil. But then on the other hand, you have these examples that you brought up. And Scripture doesn't give us a way to reconcile that. And so it seems to me that part of loving God with all our minds, especially if we believe that God is the source of all truth, as Justin Martyr and Clement of Alexandria famously said, that all truth is God's truth. So all disciplines of knowledge emanate from God as the one divine source. And it seems to me that just like nobody would raise an eyebrow over using archaeology to explain an unsolved mystery in the Bible, this is done all the time, that no one should raise an eyebrow about using philosophy in order to say, well, look, in the
Are you
biblical
under the
sense,
impression that I have a concern with philosophy here? Have you confused me with James White? Or
no, I haven't confused you. I haven't confused you with James White at all. I'm saying this more for the purpose.
so why defend the meaningfulness of using philosophy? I mean, clearly I'm doing
Yes,
philosophy, right?
yes, yes, yes.
Okay.
I realize that there may be some Reformed listeners in the audience that aren't. So I say that for their benefit rather than to try to make any
Okay.
point against you.
Okay.
But it seems to me that the modern sense of do is what is meant by strong actualization, that we wouldn't call weak actualization doing today. So that it's really it's two different senses, where the biblical authors say both of them are doing. I think we in the 21st century, speaking normal English, would say, well, it's only the strong actualization that's actually doing.
All right, let's talk about that a bit. So I disagree that there's this ancient Near Eastern sense of the word doing. I don't think that the word
Yes.
study is going to give us that. But I don't think that we need to resolve this issue. But maybe let's talk a little bit about the implication of like the activity of the Molinist God in evil, right? So maybe a good place to take this would be to discuss a little bit the argument by Greg Welty, the so-called bullet bill argument. Are you familiar with the bullet bill paper from?
Yeah, I heard him give that paper at ETS, yes,
right.
or EPS, yeah.
So without redoing the whole paper, I think that the simple point can be phrased pretty succinctly, which is to say that when you consider, our moral intuition about what makes somebody guilty of a murder, right, by firing a gun, we look at the situation where he's firing a gun, even if the bullet is standard and we're just facing the normal laws of physics, that person is not maintaining the laws of physics in place, so that technically he's not guaranteeing, he's not strongly actualizing the killing of the person, because he's not in control of those laws of nature, which could be altered and therefore prevent the bullet from killing the target. But then, without having to bend the laws of nature, you could envision the scenario where he fires a bullet that has indeterministic free will, right? So the bullet bill goes and then has the freedom to refrain from killing the target, but in fact does not refrain. We would still say that the person who fired the gun intuitively is morally responsible, especially if that person knew that the bullet would not refrain from killing the target. So we have somebody who's firing the gun with the intention of killing somebody, with a bullet that could deviate, so it's not deterministic, but the killer is knowing what the bullet would do in those circumstances, and he knows that he would kill the target. And I think that those intuitions in place, we would say, well, that person is morally guilty, right? And so similarly, the God of Molinism finds himself putting us in circumstances in which, yes, we are indeterminist, we are indeterministically doing what we do, but he knows what we would do. And it seems like by the same moral intuitions as the case of the bullet bill, we would be saying that the God of Molinism is morally blameworthy. Now, obviously, I don't say that the God of Molinism would be blameworthy for doing this. Why? Because I say that God has morally sufficient reasons and he's after the greater good. But simply the intuition of the action, right? The fact that there is determinism or indeterminism in the chain of action is not the relevant factor here. What we are saying, and this is where the Calvinist and the Molinist once again should be hanging, hugging each other like arms above shoulders, is to say we both affirm that God has a greater good that he's trying to achieve, and the fact that he's bringing about this instance of evil for good reasons is what excuses him, right? So it's what makes him not blameworthy, is that he has the right intentions and he's after a greater good. So the simple fact that he's determining or bringing about the person is not really where the debated moral difference should be, right? So what do you think of that case, and what do you make of the intuition that the killer is morally responsible, even if there is indeterministic in the chain, as long as he knows what the bullet would freely do?
Yeah. I think that the difference between the killer and God is the mens rea, is the state of mind. the killer clearly intends for this person to die. It's kind of like a mob boss ordering a hit. The mob boss orders the hit, and it's kind of like you watch The Godfather, and there are always these buffers that it goes through, so the police can never link it back to the mob boss. But we all know in The Godfather that it's Michael Corleone who murders all these people at the end, all the 5 families. And so in that case, of course, we would say that Michael Corleone is guilty of murder. Why? Well, because that was his intent for doing it. But
right.
I would say that with God, the intent is not to kill the other person. And here I would appeal to the doctrine of double effect, which says that if the actions of a third party are not intended by the actualizer, even if foreseeable to the actualizer, and if the actualizer creates the circumstances for some good reason standing contrary to the third party's actions, then the actualizer is not morally responsible for the effect of the third party. So I think that's the salient difference between the guy who fires the gun, or Michael Corleone, and God.
Right. And so in that, the Calvinist and the Molinist will be standing step by step with each other. That is, that it's the intention, right? And there's a double effect. All of those elements that you've listed are what the Calvinist would be using here to say that God, when he determines that some evil happens, he's after the greater goods, and that evil is tied necessarily to that greater good. And so obviously that means that we need to maintain a number of things, right? For using evil as a justifying reason for good, to use a greater good as a justifying reason for bringing about evil, is that the evil must be connected to the good, right? So it must be dependent on it, and it must be of at least equal weight, right? So there's a dependency and a weight condition. But as long as they are there, and again, just because I don't know what those greater goods are doesn't mean they're not there. As long as those are there, then the evil is going to be justified, and is going to be justified along the same lines as the Molinist does when defending the goodness of the Molinist God when he weakly actualizes a state of affair that includes evil. So it seems like we've successfully shown with the bullet bill example that we are either, like, the Molinist is either going to, again, self-refute because his model will accuse God of doing something wrong, or it will use resources in their own worldview, which I think are fully accessible to the Molinist to excuse God, but all of those are equally accessible for the Calvinists. So I don't think that determinism is the relevant factor in assessing the culpability of God in his sovereignty over evil here.
Do you think there that perhaps you might be kind of attacking the fact that it's an analogy rather than, the point of the analogy? I mean, clearly, yes, if you want to press the analogy for all its details, which was never intended to be so pressed, that, there's still, on my view, there would still be quantum indeterminacy because, the killer's not controlling the laws of nature and everything else. But it seems like the analogy, if you don't press it artificially, if you go for the point of the analogy rather than saying, well, there are differences. Of course, there are differences. It's an analogy.
That's not what I'm saying. That's not what I'm saying.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. No, I don't think you've understood my use of the bullet bill example here. It's simply to say that you have a case where an agent is weakly actualizing a state of affair that includes evil, right? And so we're saying that just because there's indeterminism in the chain of causation doesn't excuse the firing the shooter, right? And so what we're saying is, if now you replace these circumstances with God on the Molinist model weakly actualizing a state of affair that includes evil, then you should transfer the same moral intuitions that declare the shooter guilty onto the Molinist God and make him guilty if the knowledge of counterfactuals and placing it in the circumstances where evil happens are sufficient to declare that the person controlling that is evil. But you and I both agree that it's not sufficient to declare that person evil, because that person could have morally sufficient reasons namely a greater good that they're trying to achieve, and you use the double effect doctrine. And all of that we both agree works, but what I'm saying is that this is what the Molinist must use in order to rescue God's goodness. It's not the indeterministic nature of the chain. And so similarly, the Calvinist is going to use those same reasons, and the fact that he says there is determinism is not the relevant difference between the two models. That's the point of the illustration. So I'm not, hanging on some irrelevant details that that somehow there's a gun, whereas there doesn't need to be a gun. So I think that this is what Greg Welty's argument successfully shows, is that the Molinist is going to have a very hard time arguing that the indeterminacy of free will is what rescues the non-culpability of God when he weakly actualizes a state of affair that contains evil.
Tell me what you would think about this if I said, well, if it's possible for God to create creatures with libertarian freedom, and I believe that the plain teaching of several passages of Scripture, like Deuteronomy 30 and 1 Corinthians 11, is that humans, in fact, do have libertarian freedom, as I've defined it. If that's what, if it's logically possible to do that, and God has revealed that God has in fact done that, then you can make sense of the doctrine of double effect when you've got that the actions of the third party are not intended by the actualizer. They're foreseeable to the actualizer, yes, because of God's mental knowledge, but they're not intended by the actualizer. Whereas I think that I don't see on your view how you can say the evil wasn't intended. I think you have to say, yes, it was intended. God deterministically brought it about, but it was intended for a greater good. Is that distinction making sense, or do you still think I'm off base here?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. That's going to probably boil down into what we put behind the word intended. I think that we would say, yes, it was intended for a greater good, in the sense that it's not intended for its own sake. It's intended for the greater good that it brings about. And I think that that's a very similar thing that the Molinist is saying. So yes, he's going to say that free will is... No, but no, not even in this case, because we would not be saying, like, this is not a case where the Molinist is saying free will is the only reason why this evil happens, right? So we are taking a case where there is an actual greater good, and the greater good need not be just the obtaining of free will, right? So there, presumably you don't, I've met indeterminists, I've met incompatibilists who say that every single instance of suffering and evil in this world is explained by the fact that we have liberty and free will, and therefore God could not have avoided it. Right? I don't think you're that kind of incompatibilist, right? I think that there are at least...
No, I'm not. I think I agree. Yeah. It's interesting. I agree with you that God could have chosen to create a completely deterministic world, and that that God could have chosen a sort of, other kind of salvation where it's, just that people come into his presence, regardless of whether they libertarianly chose him, or, they just make it into heaven. And that's ultimately what salvation is. I just think that God has the option of creating creatures with libertarian freedom. And I believe, based on Scripture, that God has taken that option. I'd like, if you don't mind, to ask a sort of psychological question. That I read your Confessions of a French Atheist, and I have nothing but praise for it. I love the book Confessions of a French Atheist. So all you people in the audience, if you haven't purchased that book, please go out and do it. And here's the thing. You seem to have been a very unique case. I've never, it's intriguing to me. I've never met somebody like you. This is my 18th year of teaching. And during 18 years of teaching, I've met many atheists, both students and fellow scholars. And one thing that all of them, when I talk to them about this, they will all say, if the correct concept of God is one where God determines evil, then that's a deal breaker. That if that's the correct concept of God, of course I'm not going to become a theist. As a matter of fact, some of my atheist students are atheists because they were raised in Calvinist households. and this was the deal breaker. Other atheist students who don't really have much of a religious background, they just sort of assume atheism as the default position, have told me that, yeah, if that's the correct view of God, then they could never become an atheist. And I have to honestly say, if I were convinced that God determined people to do evil, if I thought that was the correct concept of God, I would become an atheist. So I'd love for you to explain how, as an atheist, when you came to the problem of evil, you said, unlike any other atheist that I've ever met, God determined the Holocaust, God determined ethnic cleansing in Bosnia, God determined the killing fields of Cambodia. It's all good. Could you please explain the psychology of this?
Yeah, I'm not a psychologist. There's just a few things that I can say in response to your question about the perception of the biblical God, or what I take to be the biblical God, right? The first is that I wouldn't put too much stock on the atheists' feelings about descriptions of the God of the Bible. The fact that he can feel very morally repugnant to the unbeliever should not move us too much. The introductory lines of Richard Dawkins' The God Delusion don't exactly make me shake in my boots just because he thinks that God is a malevolent bully. Is not something that I'm going to be adapting my theology about, right? The fact that the Bible declares that God, does disaster come to a city unless the Lord has done it, that's going to make some atheists think, well, if God is like that, I don't want any of this. Now, you and me both affirm those biblical teachings. And once again, the Molinists and the Calvinists are not too far apart. And I think you could imagine the simple foreknowledge Arminian or the open theist asking you the question exactly along the terms that you've said to me, like, wow, a God who makes us do evil by putting us in the circumstances that he just knows we would do wrong in. If God is like that, then I'd rather be an atheist, right? So I don't know that the psychology here helps us a lot in determining which view is correct. And I'm not too moved by this. I think that God is sovereign over evil. I think you affirm those words. I think God has good reasons behind the evil that he brings about. I think you affirm this much as a Molinist as well. And I think that we let the chips fall where they may in terms of the unbelievers. Now, in terms of practical ministry, I will say this, and I think I've said this myself a number of times. If you cannot be convinced that God can be morally perfect while determining everything that happens, then I would rather you hold on before you affirm that and you maintain that God exists, and then we'll see if I can convince you of Calvinism later on down the line. But I would prefer you being a Christian rather than a Christian non-Calvinist rather than an atheist. So we put the doctrines in the proper order, and I've had plenty of ministerial conversations where people struggling about questions around free will. And part of my evangelistic appeal is to tell them, look, I'm pretty convinced that Calvinism is true, but you don't have to be a Calvinist to be a Christian. There's plenty of sensible, smart Christians who disagree with Calvinism. Kirk MacGregor might even be one of them, God knows. But there's a value in ministry in saying, look, this is a difficult question. It's a philosophical question of very practical importance, so it's not one that has no importance, right? So that's why I like the topic, that's why I discuss it, that's why I debate it, but it's not one that the faith hangs or falls on. And so I will happily point a non-believer who's considering Christianity to the existence of non-Calvinist Christians that have a very sensible position as well. So that's my more practical side of things. But, I like what is true, and I think that Calvinism is true, so I would rather you believe what's true. That's just the bottom line.
One thing that I'm also...
Sorry.
You can go ahead. Go ahead.
Yeah, so I've kind of announced the color here that the problem of evil is by nature going to be more on the defensive from the Calvinist rather than the offensive. Maybe there's one line of positive argumentation that I can try to corner you on a little bit and see what kind of answers you do provide. So it's in the inevitability of evil. So this is where the question of evil might be a difficulty for the non-Calvinist, and it's in answering to what point sin is unavoidable for a fallen human being. On biblical terms, I think that we would be committed to saying that it's impossible to live a fully sinless life. And I've used this, as you've probably read in my book, as an argument that Martin Luther has used, that Jonathan Edwards has used as well, and given it a little bit of a philosophical, rigorous formulation. But it seems to me like if we are affirming that it's impossible for a human being to live a fully sinless life, then we are denying the principle of alternate possibility, which says that you cannot be morally responsible unless you have the ability to do otherwise. Because it seems to me we are blameworthy for our failure to live a sinless life, and yet it's impossible, given our fallen nature, to live a sinless life. So it would follow that we're either not like that we don't have the ability to live a sinless life, and that it would follow that moral responsibility does not require the ability to do otherwise. But if that's the case, then incompatibilism is not true, because incompatibilism requires that we have the ability to do otherwise when we exercise our free will. So I'm curious whether which of those premises you would grant, namely, would you grant that it's categorically impossible for a sinner to live a sinless life? Would you grant that moral responsibility does not require the ability to do otherwise? Or would you grant that the principle of alternate possibility being false entails that incompatibilism is false? And obviously, if incompatibilism is false, then Molinism is false, right? So where do you try to stop that line of argumentation?
Well, there are two ways I would try to stop it. The first way is simply to say that in the literature, the principle of alternative possibilities has been used in two ways. One is the way in which you've just defined it, where your understanding of the principle of alternate possibilities is about moral responsibility. And that's not where I go with it. I kind of shy away from those definitions of the principle of alternate possibilities. I tend to lean toward those that make the principle of alternate possibilities about the definition of freedom. So when I say the principle of alternate possibilities, I'm not talking about moral responsibility here. I'm saying, let's concede with your book that, the sinners are responsible, but I would say a person is free if and only if he sometimes could have thought or done otherwise, where the antecedent conditions, like his inner desires, his belief desire set, etc., are insufficient to determine or necessitate the agent's choice. So each choice is up to the agent himself, agent causation, and not a result of the change in the agent's inner desires. You keep you keep the inner desires exactly the same. The agent qua agent could have done otherwise.
Right, but you do think this is a necessary condition for moral responsibility, right? That's what you call freedom, and that's fine. And you typically it's a necessary condition for moral responsibility, right?
I'm not taking a position on whether that's sufficient condition for moral responsibility.
No, necessary.
I'm just saying that when I understand freedom is how I understand the principle of alternate possibilities, and I realize that there are two different ways that that phrase is used in the literature. Yeah.
Right. So, let's not get caught up by the wording of the principle of alternate possibilities on whether it's about freedom or not. What you've just described as a person being free, right? So when they have occasionally the ability to choose otherwise, all things being equal at the moment of choice, that's a necessary condition for moral responsibility on your view, is it not? Like you cannot blame the person unless they had that kind of ability, would you?
Well, I really am not interested in debating that point. I'm interested in, more of the line of, does God do anything wrong? I'm perfectly willing to blame the person here. I'm perfectly willing to say maybe it's both God and the person who do something wrong. I'm not trying to get the person off the hook.
Right,
so,
I am. I am trying to show you that your view gets them off the hook. That's the problem, right? So this is what I'm trying to see is whether or not your view of free will entails that we have the ability to live a sinless life, which would be Pelagianism and therefore a ridicule ad absurdum. So clearly, I see that you don't want to excuse the sinners, right? But I'm saying that your view would seem to call for a degree of freedom that the Bible says we cannot have, on the pain of Pelagianism.
I'm not saying that the principle of alternate possibilities, as I understand it, has anything to do with with moral responsibility, or that my argument commits me to a particular view of human moral responsibility, I think on completely different grounds from the principle of alternate possibilities, um, about moral decisions. So it's not that I feel like, well, if I'm a Molinist and I have this definition of freedom, then I've got to maintain such and such position on moral responsibility. I don't see that that conditional statement is true. And I would also say,
I'm
in
sorry.
response, yes, go ahead.
This seems hardly controversial. So this might be something, I don't know if that's something that you've just bypassed, but the freedom is a necessary condition for moral responsibility. Is it not? Right? Typically, there are two kinds of things that are necessary for us to be blameworthy or praiseworthy. One is that we would have epistemic conditions fulfilled, that we know some of the relevant facts, right? So that if I pour sugar in my wife's coffee, but unbeknownst to me, it's been replaced by poison, I'm killing my wife, but I'm not morally blameworthy for it because I didn't have knowledge of some of the relevant facts, right? So there's epistemic conditions. And then there's metaphysical freedom conditions, which is that we need to properly, freely choose the actions that we do if we are going to be blameworthy for them. And if we are lacking the freedom condition, right, if we suffer from something like coercion or manipulation or hypnosis, those kinds of conditions remove our moral responsibility because we do not satisfy the control conditions for moral responsibility. So epistemic and freedom conditions are both necessary for moral responsibility. So when you do define free will in a way that's perfectly acceptable to me as a, as coming from a Molinist, to define free will as this categorical ability to sometimes do otherwise than we do while holding in place all causally relevant antecedent factors, freedom description, that seems to me is a necessary condition for moral responsibility. But if that's the kind of free will that you take, it does lead to having to say that the sinner has the ability to live a sinless life, or they could not be blameworthy for it. And that's the dilemma I'm trying to press. And maybe that'd be my last attempt at pressing it on you if you're not prepared to face with it.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. And what I'm suggesting is that first of all, it's not entirely clear to me that that either that the doctrine of original sin is true. I come out of an Anabaptist tradition, which very much like the Eastern Orthodox tradition doesn't necessarily subscribe to the doctrine of original sin. And I would think that it's possible for a person to live a sinless life. I think Jesus proved that. And if someone said, well, that's because Jesus had a different kind of nature than ours, I think that's refuted by Paul in Romans 8, where Paul says that he took on the likeness of our sinful flesh. And he repeats the word sinful in the Greek twice, just to hammer it home, that he had the same kind of nature that we did, and yet proved that one could live a sinless life. And I would say that makes us even more morally culpable. But as I said, I don't think that leads to Pelagianism. As I read Pelagius, for example, his commentary on the book of Romans, written in around the year 410, and I look at what Pelagius taught, it seems to me you could summarize Pelagius's, it's not really a syllogism, but what he was saying in two steps. He was saying, first, human beings have libertarian freedom. Therefore, we should use our libertarian freedom to be good enough to earn our own salvation. And what I'm saying is that one is true, but two is false. How on earth could we use our libertarian freedom to earn our salvation? You seem to think that living a sinless life would earn salvation. Where on earth does that idea come from, I'm wondering? I mean, salvation is such a good that I can't think of anything human beings could do, including living a sinless life, that would ever merit it. And so I would say that Augustine made the error of saying, all right, I'm not just going to deny premise 2. I'm just not going to deny step 2. I'm going to nip this thing in the bud and deny premise 1, and to say you don't have libertarian freedom, and then introduce his concept of original sin. He coins the phrase, and that therefore you can't be good enough to earn your own salvation, rather than simply saying, look, I don't care whether you could live a sinless life or not. You still can't merit your own salvation. That's just categorically impossible. It's not the kind of thing you can merit.
Yeah, so there's a couple of things to say here. So the first is that it seems that you would be inclined to concede that the ability to live a sinless life is something that follows from this view of free will, and that you endorse it as saying, well, Jesus could do it. So my argument is that a fallen sinner is unable to live a sinless life, right? That's not to say that Jesus could not live a sinless life, but the fallen sinner's inability to live a sinless life was the point of contention between Pelagius and Augustine. And Pelagius was teaching that it's possible. He was not even saying that it's easy, or he was not even teaching that there's lots of people who actually achieve a sinless life. He was saying it's possible, and Augustine was saying, no, it's not possible to live a sinless life. So if we do affirm that it's possible to live a sinless life and that we deny original sin for the sake of liberty and free will, I think that Pelagius is owed an apology. But then after that, if we say that it's possible to live a sinless life, but that it's still not going to merit salvation, what I want to ask is salvation from what? If there is no original sin and the person lives a sinless life, what do they need to be saved from? Right? They don't deserve the wrath of God. They've lived sinlessly. And if there is no original sin, in the sense of original guilt, to say that there's an imputation of guilt from Adam, which would be the only way in which they actually have a guilt if they've lived a sinless life themselves, that would be the imputation of guilt. But presumably you would be denying both of those things. Then there's nothing they need to be saved from. So I don't think that they need to be meriting salvation if they live the sinless life. I think here the Pelagianism has run full amok.
Okay. I guess there are two ways I could respond here. One way would be to say that, and here I'll use the language of Paul Tillich, that it seems to me you can say that we are saved from the fact of just sort of the distance, you might say, between ourselves and God, that there's this huge distance between us and God. And it seems like unless God grants us something to overcome that distance, something that we cannot earn, then we do need to be saved from that, if that distance is not to continue to be there. Secondly, I could say, well, why not, suppose you're right in what you say. Suppose your reading of Pelagianism is right and my reading is wrong. Well, then why couldn't you suppose a doctrine of original sin according to which it's not possible for a sinner to live or a fallen human being to live a sinless life? But I don't see how that refutes what I've laid out as libertarian freedom. I mean, how does that show that, like, the sinner sort of in his room, doesn't have the freedom to, like, stay there and watch some porn? Or he also could have the freedom to just do nothing, or he has the freedom to curse God, or he has the freedom to go out and rob a liquor store. I mean, how does that remove his freedom from being able to choose between a range of alternatives? I just don't see that it does.
Yeah, and here that would be because the alternatives, if they're all sinful, then they're not morally relevant, right? So the ability to do otherwise that's required by this principle of alternate possibility is one in which the person does morally significantly different than they do in the actual scenario. So that's something that you can appreciate if you were to extend that view to me, right? To say, okay, my view is deterministic, so I'm saying that there's only one thing that the sinner does, and it's alleged that it's removing the blameworthiness of the sin when there's only one thing that they could do. Well, imagine that now I tweaked my Calvinist view just a little bit, and I said, no, actually, there's a million ways that they could do the exact same sin, that they could do it just a little bit differently, right? So, I mean, you could imagine, like, if the sin is lying, I could say exactly the same lie, but saying it slightly faster, like a fraction of a second faster, or a little bit louder. You get the idea, right? So that would be technically an alternate possibility. possibility, but it's not a morally relevant alternate possibility. So you wouldn't say that all of a sudden my view has removed all the problems about determinism just because there's an alternate possibility in which there's a slightly different sin. What is needed in the alternate scenario is a morally better option. And so that's why if you just rescue the ability to do one sin or another, you haven't really rescued moral responsibility on this view. As to the reading of Pelagius, maybe I don't think that we need to chuck it off to our misinterpretation, like different readings of Pelagius. I think the words are fairly clear, right? So I have a direct quote here. He says, and he's talking to Augustine, and he's saying, "Once more I repeat, I say that it is possible for a man to be without sin. And what do you say? That it is impossible for a man to be without sin. But I do not say that there is a man without sin, nor do you say that there is not a man without sin. We are disputing about what is possible and impossible, not about what is and what is not." So I think he's making it as explicit as it gets, that the dispute is to whether we could live a sinless life, not whether we in fact do, and whether there's lots of us that do it. I think the mere affirmation that it's possible for a fallen child of Adam to live a fully sinless life is fully Pelagian. And if we deny that this is a problem, then I think we owe him an apology.
Well, I would say that what I meant by we have a different reading of Pelagius is simply we have a different reading of what exactly the heresy of Pelagianism is. I don't think you would say that everything Pelagius taught is Pelagianism, is the heresy of Pelagianism. You know, it's not like every word that came out of his mouth is thereby Pelagianism. And so is the point of Pelagianism, and this seems to be the key bone of contention, is the point of Pelagianism the idea that a person could live a sinless life, but God in his middle knowledge knows that no one ever will? Or is the point of Pelagianism that people can merit their own salvation, that people can earn their own salvation? And there, I think that various councils, for example, I read the decrees of the Council of Ephesus in 431 in preparation for tonight, and I don't see how that one could really settle one of those readings over the other purely based on that. I think that there's a lot of contextual factors, historical factors to be taken in play there.
Yep, that's fair enough. I think we can leave that line of reasoning where it stands, and I'll stand with Augustine and you stand with Pelagius on this one, but maybe not the Pelagian heresy, but with Pelagius nonetheless.
Yes,
all right, that sounds
yes.
All right, guys, good stuff. Good discussion. See, this is why I brought you guys on. I knew we were going to get a nice, thorough, well done discussion. And I learned a whole bunch from you guys just by listening. And I pray that the live chat has as well. Got a lot out of this. And so we're going to jump into the Q&A right now. And so we got some questions here for you guys. And so let me make sure there ain't no super chats. All right, so here's the first question. He didn't add a name to it, but you see the question pop up on the bottom screen. Maybe a little pixelated on you guys' side, but I'll reread it if need be. So it says, do you agree that evil and death exist because of these two things? One, man's acquired knowledge of good and evil. And two, the gift of free will to choose between good and evil. Dr. Kirk, you want to take that one first?
Sure. I think, on my view, I'm not sure how much of this pertains to like Molinism versus just me. I'm not convinced that death and evil necessarily should be lumped together. For example, I don't think like plants are moral agents. I don't think that animals are moral agents. I'm going to disagree with J.P. Moreland here and say I don't think that animals have souls. I think that human beings only do. And so I don't see that the death of like a cat or something, you know, that's necessarily, you know, bad. It just seems to me that one could say that might be the course of nature. But then when you talk about evil, I think that evil would exist because of first of all, that, yeah, the gift of free will to choose between doing good or evil. And that explains why there's so-called moral evil and why there's epistemic evil. And of course, if it didn't affect us, we wouldn't even be talking about the problem of moral evil. But throwing in moral evil, I think you can explain that by appealing to quantum indeterminacy. So that's the only point I would add concerning natural evil. But it's not at all clear to me that all cases of death are in fact evil.
All right, Dr. Guillaume.
Yeah, so I don't have much to add on the question here. Maybe just point out that I do affirm free will, right? So I just say that it's compatible with determinism. So yes, I do affirm that there is such a gift as free will, and I just deny that this brings about a limitation on what God can bring about here. I was curious about your usage, Kirk, of the quantum indeterminacy to discuss natural evil, and maybe without jumping back into a full-blown debate. It just seems odd to me. It seems like very small stuff in the grand scheme of things. To think of, like, there's a huge avalanche and like a dozen of people die under the snow. Would you say that this natural evil, we can justify God's ways because there was quantum indeterminacy in the natural order that brought about the avalanche? It seems like God is fully in control of the snow, right? I mean, he can calm the storms. He can do whatever he wants with that avalanche. He can stop it. So if he decides to let it go and people die, it doesn't seem like we can just use quantum indeterminacy as a very big factor in this providential event. Do you make much of a use of that quantum indeterminacy? I don't see that it should be there.
What I would say for me is the difference. Is first of all, what is God's intent? What's the mens rea of God here? And secondly, is the quantum indeterminacy, does that play a role such that God middle knows that, were it not for the quantum indeterminacy, the snow that God sends and whatever, that the avalanche wouldn't happen. And I would say that if an avalanche happens, God knows the counterfactual of indeterminacy, that, had it not been for this indeterminate state, the snow wouldn't itself, trigger the avalanche, but because of quantum indeterminacy, that's why it in fact does. But I realize that's a view that's kind of unique to me. And it's not one that a Molinist has to endorse.
Yeah, sure.
All right. So we have another question here. This is for you, Dr. Guillaume. It says, where does he stand on the infralapsarianism and supralapsarianism question?
Yeah, where I stand is that those words have probably different meanings depending on who actually uses those words. So I don't really take a position until we clarify what it's referring to. I think that sometimes this debate is seen to be about whether or not the fall itself was indeterministic. Right. So in that debate, then I would say I'm taking the view that it is deterministic, because I, with the Westminster Confession, affirm that God determines everything that comes to pass, and everything includes the very first sin as well. So I take that fully theological deterministic position about the fall. And so if the infra versus supra debate lies on whether the fall was deterministic, I take the view that it was. But sometimes that same debates, the same words, are taken to be as to whether or not God sees us as already fallen when he decrees our plan to redeem us. And I'm not sure. I have a very strong opinion about that. So I think that debate is not of great importance. And I think that I'd rather discuss the more philosophically rigorous questions of what God determines rather than this in terms of the logical order of the decrees. I'm not sure that we have a very good basis to judge on this. What I do say is that God decrees everything, and so he has a good purpose for all of those things, and he is sovereign in the matters of election indeed. That's the most I can say. I'm not sure that educates a lot about the infra versus supra debate.
All right. Dr. Kirk, any thoughts?
No, I don't have any thoughts on that. I do find it somewhat intriguing. Guillaume, do you think that, just as a historical curiosity, do you think that Augustine in his late writings after responding to Pelagius, and the Westminster Confession are on the same page on Adam's sin? Or do you see Augustine as saying, no, Adam, and Eve had the ability to either sin or not to sin? And the Westminster Confession says, no, Augustine, you're not pressing your determinism hard enough. That in fact that was determined as well.
Yeah, I'm not too sure how to read Augustine on this, and my reading of him is a little bit distant for me to comment on whether he affirms that or not. If we take just the formulation you just used, I think there's still ambiguities there, right? Because there's a meaningful sense in which even the theological determinist can say that Adam and Eve had the ability to not sin that we don't have, but without thereby committing themselves to saying that they had a libertarian capacity. They're simply saying that they have not yet been tainted by this original inclination, and so it's consistent with their non-sinful nature to choose not to sin, while simply God's providential activity determines that they will in fact sin, right? So that's still remaining a coherent theological determinist position in which we can say meaningfully that they have an ability not to sin. It's just a conditional inability. It's a conditional ability, but it's simply an affirmation that their nature has not yet been tainted to the point of necessitating the sin, and that something else has to come in and necessitate the sin. Whereas we, as fallen children of Adam, now we can say we don't have the ability to avoid sinning, and this is the line of reasoning I was pressing you on with this inability to avoid sinning in our life. So that distinction between us and Adam pre-fall can still be meaningfully described as having the ability of refraining from sin, even if we're not saying that this is a libertarian ability to refrain from the sin, all things being just as they are on the moment of choice. So given that coherent distinction, I don't know that I have to disagree with Augustine when he says, if he says that Adam and Eve could have refrained from sinning. That doesn't necessarily deny theological determinism. But again, whether Augustine affirms it or not is not what drives my my belief. So I'm gonna go with what I think is true.
All right. And here is a super chat. Thank you, Jamie, for the super chat. This question is for both. Explain the mystery of iniquity and why one man believes and not the other in 30 seconds or less.
I guess I'll start. I think one person believes and not the other, not because one is any better than the other. I think it's rather because one has freely chosen to appropriate God's enabling grace and to humbly confess their need of God, pledge their life and their allegiance to God.
Dr. Guillaume?
So if I have 30 seconds, then I'm going to go with this. And not only so, but also when Rebekah had conceived children by one man, our forefather Isaac, though they were not yet born and had done nothing either good or bad, in order that God's purpose of election might continue, not because of works, but because of him who calls, she was told, the older will serve the younger. As it is written, Jacob I loved, but Esau I hated. What shall we say then? Is there injustice on God's part? By no means, for he says to Moses, I will have mercy on whom I have mercy, and I will have compassion on whom I have compassion. So then it depends not on human will or exertion, but on God who has mercy. For the scripture says to Pharaoh, for this very purpose I have raised you up, that I might show my power in you, and that my name might be proclaimed in all the earth. So then he has mercy on whomever he wills, and he hardens whomever he wills. That's my explanation of why one believes and when another not.
Just like a Calvinist to be all with Romans 9.
I have to indulge in some degrees of cliches, otherwise am I really a Calvinist?
Yeah. Boy, I don't think Romans 9 means anything like what you just said, but that's a whole different debate.
All right, man. We have another super chat here. Thank you, Israel, for the super chat. Appreciate you.
I just read the text. How does it not mean what I just said?
Well, you're assuming that the interlocutor of Romans 9 is the Pelagian synergist kind of arguing against predestinary determinism.
I literally just read the text. This is all I've done. I'm not assuming anything. Well, I read the text.
Right.
This is a place where we should agree. You should agree with me that all of this is true, right?
Well, I agree with the text, but
yeah,
I also believe that one needs to use grammatico-historical exegesis to understand this the way Paul intended and the way a first century Jewish audience would understand it.
Yes.
Yeah, and I don't think that a first century Jewish audience would understand that text to have the implications that you seem to think it has.
Right.
All right. And here is a question once again from Israel. Thank you for the super chat, Israel. Appreciate you, buddy. What is the nature of free will? Ordered or non-ordered? A or not A? If it's A, why would that not imply an algorithmic way of choice? And if it's not A, why is it that not random, thus no moral control?
So I think I will let Kirk apply his grammatical, historical exegesis skills on this question and tell me what that means, because I'm going to need some interpretation.
I'm going to take my best stab at this thing. I would say that according to the doctrine of agent causation, I think the best person to read is Roderick Chisholm. And Chisholm talks about agent causation as that we, being made in the image of God, are in some small sense unmoved movers, as God is. And so just as one wouldn't say that God's choice of creating this universe as opposed to, or this feasible world as opposed to some other equally good feasible world, or no world at all. I mean, God doesn't need us in order to achieve, anything. God's not dependent on us. God was, in a perfect state, in the intra-Trinitarian relations, logically prior to the existence of the universe. But no one would say, well, because it's God who's the agent, that therefore it's just random. I don't see that. I don't see that that's the case. That if it's not algorithmic, then it's random. Now, I agree that I haven't gone into the question tonight of the no moral control bit. And I would say that if it is possible for people, at least sometimes, to choose between, and by choose, I mean choose categorically, not choose conditionally. If it's possible for people to choose categorically whether or not that they can do evil, then yes, you've got a moral control. And so you went with Romans 9, Guillaume. I'm going to go with Deuteronomy chapter 30, verses 11 to 20, where Moses commands the second generation Israelites, many of whom we know are unregenerate. I mean, for goodness sake, read the book of Joshua, but he commands them to follow the Torah, the 613 mitzvot. And that includes the command to love God with all one's heart, soul, and strength. And I checked, the translation is undisputed from the Hebrew. Moses says, for this commandment that I command you today is not too hard for you, neither is it beyond your reach. It is not in heaven, so that you should say, who will ascend to heaven for us and bring it to us, that we may hear it and do it? Neither is it beyond the sea, so that you should say, who will go over the sea for us and bring it to us, that we may hear and do it? But the word is very near you. It is in your mouth and in your heart, so you can do it. And then he says, therefore, I set life and death before you. Choose life. So it's interesting to me that John Calvin never deals with the beginning point of that text, which seems to me to clearly, grammatico-historically indicate the categorical ability to do otherwise. And I would say the same thing is true with the passage about when a believer faces temptation, that the believer can either succumb to the temptation or take the way out. And the ability that the believer can actually choose. Not that, well, if things were different, then they would have been able to choose. Or if they had desired differently, which they don't control their desires, then they would have been able to do differently.
All right. Guillaume, you got any thoughts on that, or did you already share your thoughts?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I can comment on this as well. Again, we want to limit the back and forth at this point, but yes, I do think that this view is implausible. That is committing you to saying that in the moment of choice, you could do better without having to be a better person at all. Like being just as sinful as you are, you're able to do better than you in fact do without having to be better, which is inconsistent with what Jesus teaches about the expressions of our hearts, right? So the bad tree bears bad fruit, the good tree bears good fruit, and this is how you get better choices, by having an actual transformed heart. The libertarian view on this requires that being just as sinful as you are, all things inside and outside of you being just as they are, you have the ability to make a better choice. And I say, no, you don't. And so when it's declaring that the choice is not too hard, that it's not out of your reach, it's describing the fact that you could do it if only you wanted, right? Which is a conditional understanding of ability, which is consistent with the necessity of being a better person to make a better choice, rather than arbitrarily making it like I'm going to choose good or choose evil, while my heart and my mind are exactly the same in the exact same circumstances, which I do think is a very unintuitive view of our moral choices on the moment of choice.
All right. And this is a good question from Slam. Thank you for the super chat. Dr. Kirk, were you determined to wear that Molinist tie tonight?
Well, it's interesting. Yes. This is not a Molinist tie. I think Guillaume and I can agree that even if we, disagree on the whole determined part, it's not a Molinist tie. This is actually the logo of McPherson College where I teach.
Oh, okay. I actually thought it was a tie, for your last name, but
no,
there you go. Okay, cool.
I would say that the Calvinist is going to be hard-pressed, but he will maintain that God has morally sufficient reasons for allowing this crime against fashion. So there is a consistent view of the Calvinist.
Oh, man, that's hilarious. All right, here's another super chat, guys. That's right. If all libertarian free will arguments fail, why think God has it?
Well, if all libertarian free will arguments fail, there obviously wouldn't be a good reason to think that God had it. That's why I tried to give an argument for it. And so, for the questioner, I would just encourage the questioner to, go back and listen to the debate and think which one of those, or listen to the discussion and say, which of those premises do I deny? When I was trying to say, look, if even God doesn't have libertarian freedom, then you wind up with a universe that doesn't have time in it, that doesn't have a temporal beginning, or you wind up with a universe that is a metaphysically necessary being, and those things are false. So I don't grant that all libertarian free will arguments fail. Now, if they all did fail, then of course you couldn't think that God had it. That would just be inconsistent.
Yeah, I guess we didn't really address that argument in your opening statement, and I don't know that we have the time to adequately respond to it. I guess from memory, my concern there was that you were probably confusing libertarian free will with indeterminacy, right? So that's when we say that somebody has libertarian free will, we are affirming the thesis of libertarianism, which contains the thesis of incompatibilism. And so a Calvinist could say that God somehow has some actions that are indeterministic without saying that it's libertarian free will in the sense that it's incompatible with moral responsibility. So the Calvinist is committed to affirming compatibilism, which means that he's committed to denying incompatibilism, which means denying libertarian free will. But indeterministic actions don't have to be libertarianly free, because we could say that God has the ability to create the world like this with indeterministic sets of circumstances without saying that moral responsibility hangs on the balance. So when you use my own argument where I do connect God's nature, like his inability to sin, right? I use it in my book to show that moral responsibility does not require the ability to do otherwise. And so, indeed, if God is impeccable and yet praiseworthy, it shows that the principle of alternate possibility is false, and so we can apply that to human beings, properly accounting for the differences between God and man, there is still a case here to be made, and I make it in my book. But that doesn't say that God does not have the ability to do indeterministic choices, as long as we don't connect it with moral responsibility. So that's my very brief response to your argument there, but there would probably be more to dive in and to respond to.
All right. We have another super chat here. Thank you, Jimmy Gray, for the super chat. This is for Dr. Guillaume. If the scope of the all that God is pleased to do in Isaiah 46:10 includes the wickedness of man, how do you square that with Psalms 5, verse 4?
Yeah, and I would say that God is not pleased with the wickedness; He's pleased with the outcome of the wickedness, right? So He's again, I think that's very much what Kirk has described as the doctrine of double effect. So we wouldn't say that God is pleased with the evil in itself. He's pleased with the good that is coming out of the evil. Just like we would say that God is not pleased with the crucifixion in itself, but he's pleased with the salvation outcome of having the Son of God pay the penalty for our sins. So the Bible does use the word of it pleased the Lord to crush him, right? Yet we would say that it doesn't please God to kill somebody, but it's just a different application of the word please. And I would say that in the strongest sense of pleasing, he's not pleased in isolation by the evil. He's pleased by the greater good that he's trying to secure through that evil. So I don't think that I have a specific problem with Psalm 5:4 in explaining how God is not pleased by wickedness. It's just a different sense than when the Bible also says that it pleased the Lord to crush Jesus.
Dr. Kirk?
Well, I would completely agree with that. That's a point where, you know, I don't have anything to add.
All right.
Yeah.
And we have another question.
I think that the Molinist and the Calvinist are shoulder to shoulder
Yes.
on that. Yeah.
There you go. Share that hug one day, right? Go share that hug one day. All right, we have another question here, guys. Couple more questions, then we're going to shut this down. I don't want to kill your brains over there. All right, so if God has decreed evil for a specific purpose, as in the greater good, then is the purpose regarding the end result considered to be evil as well? If yes, then how do you explain Acts chapter 2, verse 23?
I would think that we would both answer no to the question. And so therefore there wouldn't be a need for us to explain Acts 2:23. Is that the way you see it, Guillaume?
Yeah, I'm not sure how to interpret the question exactly, but it seems to me like this is another one where the Molinists and the Calvinists are going to be together on this, saying that God has a good purpose and he's using evil actions in the way, and the only disagreement is going to be as to whether or not that evil was libertarianly free or not. But yeah, we would both say that God is using some evil as a means to an end, which is to secure a greater good. Acts 2:23, this man was handed over to you by God's deliberate plan and foreknowledge, and you, with the help of wicked men, put him to death by nailing him to the cross. Yeah, I think this is God's providence over the crucifixion of Jesus, which I think both Calvinists and Molinists are very strongly affirming. That God is the one doing so. He's the one who brought about the crucifixion of Jesus with the greater purpose of bringing about the salvation of his elect people.
All right. Any more thoughts, Dr. Kirk?
Nope.
All right. And here's a question for you, Dr. Kirk. Why did God choose the possible world of killing men, women, and children in the Old Testament? And why is that softer for an atheist, Canaanites, etc.?
Yeah. Here, I would simply say that I'm not sure the Molinist is committed by virtue of Molinism to say that God killed men, women, and children in the Old Testament. I think the Molinist who also says, I believe in biblical inerrancy, would face that question of killing men, women, and children in the Old Testament. And I have to say, I've wrestled with this. I don't personally take Bill Craig's view on the reading of like the slaughter of the Canaanites and things like that. I think that I happen to think that the early church was right when the early church talked about different methods different ways of interpreting Scripture. It might surprise you to say this, but I think that, yes, that perhaps it might be the case that what the human author intended and what the original audience understood may not be what God intends for us to get out of the text. And if that's the case, then you could be able to say that God isn't the one who is actually killing them. Now, if you say, but okay, whether God is the one actually, ordering the hit or not, why does God choose that feasible world? I would say because that feasible world is in the status of being tied for the best feasible world. And my condition for best feasible world is not having libertarian freedom, just as an end in itself. It's optimal salvation. It's that people coming into a personal knowledge of God, the knowledge of all goodness and love, whom they've libertarianly chose to love. So I would say that any other world as salvifically good as this world would have entailed maybe not that particular evil, but evils which are just as bad. And so that God, if he's going to choose a world with libertarian freedom, would choose one such world.
All right, Dr. Guillaume.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that it's a specific problem for the Molinists either. I think that, the Deuteronomy 32:39, I kill and make alive, I wound and I heal. And 1 Samuel 2:6, the Lord kills and brings to life, he brings down to Sheol and raises up. And I don't think it's a problem for the Calvinists, and I don't think it's a problem for the Molinists either. So the Lord kills and makes alive, and he's the author and sustainer of life, and he has the prerogative of ending someone's life. So there's the separate question of whether he commanded the killing of these people in the Old Testament, and this is going to be an apologetic question that has little to do with his providential control of those actions, unless you are saying both that he neither commanded it nor even wanted any of this to happen for any greater good, that just free will was the reason why the Israelites just went and did something wrong, and God, in virtue of leaving us free will, could not stop this massacre, then I don't think that free will has a lot of relevance in conversations about those difficulties in the Old Testament here. So I think that both Kirk and I are committed to saying that God can take a life. He kills and he brings to life, he brings down to Sheol and raises up. And I don't think it's a problem for either of our views.
All right, this will be the final question. I know everyone, it's a bunch of questions out there. I'm not going to be able to get to all of them, and these guys have to go to sleep at some point in time. So this will be the final question here of the night. This is for Dr. Guillaume. Does God's predestination of sin logically precede his foreknowledge of sin? If yes, how is he not the author of evil? If no, how is that not middle knowledge?
Yeah, so I don't think it precedes logically his foreknowledge of sin. I think that he determines everything that happens. So that's another way, right? So the logical preceding is simply a way of saying that he does not determining it. It does not determine it, and I do affirm that he determines it. So I guess I want to deny that first one. And so how is he not the author of evil? Then that's the very long question that somewhat we've discussed tonight, but I treat more in my book. On purely that formulation of whether he's the author of evil, my answer is I don't even know until we clarify what we mean by author of evil. There's a very mild sense in which it's perfectly fine to say God is the author of evil, and it's the mild sense that's employed by the biblical statements when God says that he's doing those things, right? So that's what we discussed earlier. The Bible says that he's the Lord who does all those things. The evil that the Lord had brought about upon Job, who has spoken and it came to pass unless the Lord has commanded it? Is it not from the mouth of the Most High that good and bad come? So in that biblical sense of God doing it, then I have no problem saying God is the author of evil, but I deny that it makes him inappropriately involved in evil in such a way that he's blameworthy. So if that's what's intended by author of evil, I affirm it, but deny that it's bad. But if something stronger than this is intended by the phrase author of evil, like something that makes him actually blameworthy, then I will deny that he is in that sense, and I'll deny that my Calvinism entails that he is in that sense. So that's the two premises of the argument, one of which I'll deny depending on what is meant by author of evil.
All right. Dr. Kirk?
Well, here I would say that the Molinist does believe that God has the kind of knowledge that the Calvinist thinks. In other words, I believe that God, in God's divine creative decision, as part of that decision, decides the truth value of what you might call all of these deterministic counterfactuals. That God determines that, yes, if I were to put the person in such and such circumstances and I were to determine what they were to do, then I determine that they do this rather than that. What the Molinist is saying is that's not the only type of counterfactual that God knows. God also knows counterfactuals of libertarian freedom. God also knows counterfactuals of quantum indeterminacy, and that those are known by God logically prior to God's divine creative decree. And that for the Molinist, God's knowledge of such things would God's knowledge of both of those counterfactuals when God knows them is just part of what it means for God to be omniscient.
All right, good stuff. Thank you guys so much for coming on The Gospel Truth, man. Before I let you guys go, I do want to make sure that you are able to have a chance to tell the audience where can they find you, all your writings, your books, blogs, scholarly articles. Where can they find you at, and where can they get connected with you at, Dr. Kirk, if you don't mind?
Well, first thing to do is to look me up on the McPherson College directory, and my email address is right there. I'm quite happy to receive emails. I have several responsibilities in my job, so it may take me, a week or 2 weeks to get back to you, but I will eventually do that. So one place you can go for books that I've written is to just go to Amazon.com and to type in my name. If you want sort of a full list of my publications, I have a ResearchGate account, so you can look up that. And I believe that that is current to all of the publications on my CV right now.
All right. Yeah, by the way, I thought, I didn't think you were going to respond to me, Dr. Kirk, when I emailed you. I didn't think you was going to respond. I thought you was going to be too busy or something, man. So I'm glad you responded. Dr. Guillaume, where can they connect with you at, man? What you got?
Yeah, the first thing to do for me is to thank Kirk. Thank you very much for this conversation. It was very pleasant. I really enjoyed interacting with you and reading your work as well. So thank you for coming on and having this friendly exchange with me. I really enjoyed it. And thanks, Marlon, for inviting me.
I would say exactly the same thing back to you. This was quite enjoyable.
Very good. All right, wonderful. And so for my material, I guess, so in terms of writing, people can look, my main work on this is Excusing Sinners and Blaming God, available wherever you buy books. And if they want to get in touch with me, I'm a little bit active on Twitter. My handle is Theology, like theology, but with GUI at the end. So that's THEOLOGUI. And there they can see my witty banter and occasional theological reflections, and they can even get in touch with me there.
All right, cool, guys. So I hand out gifts to everyone that comes on here, more like, well, not interviews. I don't hand out gifts for interviews, but when people take time to prepare for debates and discussions, I do hand out gifts. So I would like to send both of you a gift from me to you, just a token of my appreciation for taking time with your families, busy schedules to come on. So I'll be reaching out to you guys to get the contacts to get that gift over to ASAP. That said, once again, I appreciate you guys. I love the work you're doing. Keep doing your thing. And I'm praying for both of you to stay strong in the Lord. Be good. And I will talk to you guys soon. All right. Take care. All right.
All right.
Thank you very much.
Well.
Bye.
All right, guys. All right. I pray that this has been a blessing to you guys out there. This question of problem of evil is a big question. It is a huge question that cannot even be tackled in a 2-hour stream. And that's why I encourage you guys, if you guys are interested in this question, in this thought, in this understanding, in this very, very deep, difficult question of problem of evil, I do encourage you guys to go out there and buy these guys' content. Obviously they have some areas where they agree, they have some areas they disagree. But it'd be good to dive in both of these areas of thought, because this question is a very difficult question, especially when you're encountering non-believers, right? This is the number one go-to problem that non-believers claim that they have with the God of the Bible, is the problem of evil, right? Why does God allow evil? Why does he allow good people to suffer? Why does he allow natural evils to take place? These are the type of questions that we as Christians should be able to tackle. So whether you are from a Molinist position, a Calvinist position, you should be able to tackle this question in a way that's somewhat satisfying. You may not have all the questions and answers that an atheist would desire, but nonetheless, you should have some sort of response to this difficult and, I would say, problematic discussion, a problem of evil. And so just make sure you guys are on, and make sure you guys go visit these guys' websites, blogs. Make sure you check them out on Amazon to see what they have, and invest in these guys, right? Invest in them so they can keep doing what they do. With that said, make sure you guys are staying in the loop with the God's truth. Do not fall out of the loop. Hit that subscribe and that notification bell. If this show has been a blessing to you, if this show has been satisfying to you, we have a whole bunch of shows coming up in the future after this one. So if you are interested in seeing these shows and seeing them live, you want to make sure you subscribe and hit that notification bell so you don't miss out on any of those shows, okay? Because I would hate for you to miss out on the live shows. You won't be able to get into the live chats, things like that. So make sure you subscribe to the Gospel Truth, all right? All right, so that said, I'm going to get out of here, and I'm going to get some rest myself. I thank you guys for joining me. May God bless you, and may God keep you. Bye.